This is the type of case that concerns me more than a lot of other situations. I think that this administration is going to push harder and harder and more retaliatory and vindictive as it can get. I'm hopeful that at some point both sides will realize that this type of conduct just cannot continue.
Is Donald Trump looking for new vengeance against James Comey, the former director of the FBI? That's certainly the suspicion this week after two new developments. The New York Times has reported that Comey was tailed by law enforcement back in May as he returned from vacation in North Carolina. Comey, the Times reported, was followed by authorities in, quote, unmarked cars and street clothes. He also allegedly had his location tracked via his cell phone. That came after Comey had posted a photo of seashells on a beach, spelling out 8647, widely understood as an anti-Trump message, though its precise meaning is debated. Separately, sources inside Trump's Department of Justice told Fox News that Comey was under criminal investigation, along with former CIA Director John Brennan, for matters pertaining to the old Trump-Russia probe. But while the Fox report detailed Brennan's alleged misdeeds, there were no specifics given at all about Comey. These developments all come amid broader concerns about Trump's weaponization of government to go after enemies, critics, law firms and others. To discuss the Comey feud and its ramifications, I'm joined by Mark Zaid. Mark is a lawyer who specialises in national security cases. But more than that, he's also especially well placed to talk about Trump's targeting tactics. Back in March, a Trump memo revoked Mark's security clearance, alongside much more famous names, including Joe Biden, Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. Mark is suing over that memo and his case is ongoing. Mark, thanks for joining us. Let's first of all take these details about Jim Comey being tailed. What do we make of that?
Well, we make of it as an overreach. Look, it is the job of the Secret Service, and it has been for more than a century, to guard the President of the United States. Now, I have worked with the Secret Service countless times over the last 35 years. In fact, I represented two of the Secret Service agents that were with President Kennedy when he was assassinated in 1963, and I represent one of the agents who was at Butler, Pennsylvania when President Trump was almost unfortunately assassinated back last year. And then I rep countless agents and officers throughout for whatever reason it might be. Now, let's look at what this was. James Comey, the former director of the FBI, took a photo of seashells that someone else had put out there. And if anyone does research online, you will find, including on Amazon, t-shirts that say the same thing about Joe Biden as does for President Trump. As you indicated, what's it mean? Lots of people have different interpretations. But when there is a viable threat, the Secret Service should obviously investigate it. But what type of imminence or even credibility did anyone reasonably think that James Comey was going to take some sort of physical action against Donald Trump, who in fact was out of the country at the time this became an issue? This is the type of case that concerns me more than a lot of other situations, because good people inside this agency and elsewhere had to agree to take this action. And I can't imagine they didn't think it was against their better judgment. For the careerists who were in agencies like the Secret Service, the Department of Homeland Security, its parent agency, to think that this was a viable threat against the President of the United States, yet they acted on it, raises a lot of concerns as to where this country is going, at least in my opinion.
Well, just to put the finer point on what the counter-argument would be, that 8647 message did, certainly was anti-Trump, and you alluded to the T-shirts that have a similar message about President Biden, but apparently Secret Service had at least scrutinized people who sent those messages regarding Biden. So Trump people would say, what's the difference? You would say there's no imminent threat from James Comey, basically, right?
Well, context matters, right? what the intent is behind it makes a difference. Looking into the background of the person makes a difference. When I represented one of the primary whistleblower in the first Trump impeachment, I received many death threats, and I would forward those to the FBI, and they would investigate all the really serious ones. One man got prosecuted. He had a long-standing criminal record that dated back 30 plus years, right? That person is a greater risk than if someone had said the same thing and they had absolutely no record whatsoever. So to think that Comey was going to do something is somewhat out there. Now, that doesn't mean you don't say something to him, you don't raise it to him, you caution him as to how people could interpret this, because the bigger concerns are not that someone like Comey would do something. It would be that someone, in this case, on the left radical extremist wing, might take it to a different level as if it was a message being sent to them, just like we see on the right wing. There are crazies on both sides. So saying something to Comey would make sense. Tailing him, surveilling, tracking his phone, that is usually reserved for some of the most serious threats when there really is not only a viability of a concern, but also an imminence of it. And I just can't see how anyone rationally could see it that way. I'll give you another example.
Mhm.
This is where people are politicizing and weaponizing, as you mentioned by term, these types of situations. In the first Trump administration, I casually tweeted out the word hashtag coup when I was referring to Sally Yates, then the acting attorney general of the United States, disobeying an order, an executive order by the president, and she got fired. Deservedly so, because she refused to implement the president's wishes, and that's his prerogative. That was then interpreted by the right wing MAGA crowd as if I was launching some sort of organized coup against the president of the United States, which is, outright ridiculous, because I never took any action other than saying hashtag coup, impeachment will follow. And guess what? I was right. So there is a difference between what the text is, what the intent is, who the person is who's making these types of statements, and then, what kind of resources are available to investigate and what is justifying this type of action other than targeting of enemies.
And in relation to that, what do you think is the actual purpose then, the real purpose? Do you think it's intended to intimidate Comey? Do you think it's about showing that you could flex this muscle of tailing a prominent person like that? What do you think is actually going on here?
Yeah, I doubt that James Comey's intimidated by it. Look, it's not a comfortable feeling, I'm sure, to know when you're being targeted by the president of the United States at any given time. But without a doubt, it's sending a message. The message is sent to the base, the MAGA base, about, we're not going to take any prisoners type situation. We are going to stand by and respond. Sort of, I always think of my Star Trek II Wrath of Khan. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and it's very cold in space. And this is that type of retaliatory attitude that this administration launches, contrary to the statements they said coming in, where weaponization and politicization of the Justice Department was something they were aghast at because they said it was being done towards them so that they would not repeat it. Well, obviously, that is not the course of action they've been taking.
So what about this, to my mind, rather vague suggestion of criminal investigation of Comey over the Russia probe? My first thought there was that the timing was interesting because, as we both know, the DOJ has been under a lot of pressure from their own base because of the whole underwhelming Jeffrey Epstein stuff. And then, what happens? Well, lo and behold, we're investigating Comey and Brennan, two obvious sort of enemies of the MAGA base. But what do you think? Do you think there could be anything in that case? What do you think's going on there?
It's like you think of some old Looney Tunes cartoon of a lion attacking you, so you throw a piece of raw meat, across the cage to distract them and get away. And that's exactly what's going on here. Look, most, if if there are any viable crimes, most of the statute of limitations have already passed. This has been investigated not only by Congress more than once, the Inspector General's office, multiple journalists, of course, books on this. To think that there's something criminal, I suppose I saw one reference that Brennan testified before Congress in 2023. So perhaps they can make some sort of argument that he perjured himself, which that statute of limitations would still exist. But the notion that somehow what they did with respect to uh, Hurricane Crossfire or any other type of investigation, which of course people don't realize, it's not just them. Yeah, they're the head of their respective agencies, but there are hundreds and hundreds of individuals who played roles in each of those cases. It's actually one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton wasn't prosecuted for the email fiasco that Comey was investigating, which actually I criticized at the time because she should have known better. But there were multiple people on the email. To be able to single out, one person of taking some sort of action, separate and apart for if you say there was perjury that they individually made, but as part of an investigation, it's almost unmanageable to think that somehow they could be targeted. I really do believe this is hey, look here, here's the shiny light. Pay attention to this side of the room, not the other side, because the MAGA crowd is crazy pissed off right now about the Jeffrey Epstein files.
Where do you think overall this whole approach goes? I mean, joining the dots here, there's this stuff that we have been discussing, there's your own case, there are the attempts to intimidate law firms, intimidate universities, and so on and so forth. Do you simply expect that to continue on the part of the Trump administration and to meet with pushback from some of those targets and concessions from other of those targets? What's in summary the big picture here?
Yeah, I think the big picture is, and unfortunately, it starts out as a negative one. I don't think we are anywhere close to hitting bottom. I think that this administration is going to push harder and harder and more retaliatory and vindictive as it can get, with the positive aspect of that being that the federal courts are keeping the executive branch in check. They are enforcing and upholding the rule of law. And I do think, though, while we're going to hit bottom at some point in time, when I don't know, I do think we're going to come out of this stronger as a country, because I'm hopeful that at some point both sides will realize that this type of conduct just cannot continue. The notion of lawfare, which is happening now on both sides, the notion of political rhetoric that as soon as an administration does something wrong, some member of Congress threatens impeachment, again on both sides. That is just not the way that this country can function. And when we are so divisive in nature between the two parties, the only things that will happen at the end will be bad. So I am hopeful that we will rise out of this in a positive way, but there's going to be a lot of pain along the way, unfortunately.
Mark Zaid, on that mixed note, but I think sobering note, thanks for joining us at The Hill.
Anytime.